privilege and a great pleasure at the same time to be able to introduce Ben Grant, who is our mastermind at this wonderful event. He's also a departmental lecturer in English literature at the Department of Continuing Education at University of Oxford. His research interests include post-colonial and word literature, theory and practice of the aphorism, travel literature, psychoanalysis, and translation studies, so all areas that are somehow connected to Jenny Diski's writing. He has authored 2 books for Routledge, one on post-colonialism, psychoanalysis, and Burton, and one for this wonderful series, New Critical Idiom, on the aphorism and other short forms. And even more excitingly, he's currently writing a book on Jenny Diski for Manchester University Press that I'm sure all of us are already looking forward to. And without any further ado and comments, Ben, it's your conference and now it's your paper, and I very much look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gerd. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Okay, so my title is Curled Up in the Place of Questions, Belief and Doubt in Jenny Diski's Then Again. In 1999, during an interview with Jenny Diski by the American writer Frederick Touton, the following exchange took place. Diski: I'm very interested in what faith is. It is a gift, it's grace coming down, but you have to start with some kind of belief before you can accept that. Faith is an absurd notion that you either accept for no very good reason, or you don't. I think it's heroic. Touton: You think that faith is heroic? Diski: I do. I think a total lack of belief is also heroic, and I think they're in some way related. Touton: Which side do you fall on? I don't have any belief, but I'm quite religious about it. Touton: But you have faith. Laughter. Diski: I don't think I do, but I'm intrigued by faith. I haven't really gotten through that one, so I keep writing about it. As Diski says, faith is a subject to which she kept returning. And the place where she writes most directly about the relationship between faith and what she here calls the equally heroic total lack of belief is her 1990 novel, Then Again, in which Katja, a contemporary London teenager who experiences divine grace, is juxtaposed with Esther, a 14th century Central European Jewish girl who questions all religious belief. On the face of it, these two heroines are opposites, but Diski's novel explores the ways in which they are nevertheless in some way related. Most obviously, on the level of the plot, they are linked through a third heroine, Katja's mother, also named Esther, who is cyclically connected to her medieval namesake in dreams. In relation to their historical contexts, the girls have in common the fact that the questions they ask are inadmissible in the societies to which they belong. Consequently, Esther is burnt at the stake as a witch and a heretic, and Katja is labelled as mad. By juxtaposing these two characters, the novel draws attention to the structural similarities between medieval society, where doubt was prohibited, and the contemporary world, in which an experience of God's grace is taken to signify mental illness. In both contexts, the asking of tabooed questions is violently repressed, especially if the person asking them is a young woman. However, Then Again also explores the relationship between belief and doubt in more philosophical terms, and in this paper I will argue that in doing so, the novel implicitly engages with and critiques the Western philosophical tradition of the individual self. Let's begin then by looking at the precise nature of the medieval Esther's doubt and Katja's belief. As a young girl, Esther's entire family and the Jewish community to which she belonged were massacred by their Christian neighbours in the genocide of the Jews which swept through Europe in the wake of the Black Death. Esther was then brought up as a Christian and renamed Elizabeth by a couple who had directly participated in the murder of her family. Though she doesn't remember these events or her origins, Esther has a profound sense of being an outsider, and at the age of 14, this alienation crystallizes in the form of, quote, a question which came into her head as though someone else were speaking it, end quote. This question is what for? And what for was no more than a beginning. In the space where the real her existed, the ghosts of other questions jostled for recognition. A vague muddle of query grew like a fungus on stale bread, its spores hovering in the air, recognizing a host on which they could thrive. They settled in the place where what for had grown, and waited for their further development. What for thus opens up a place of questions in which the Esther who is described in this passage as the real her is later said to be curled up. This Esther is distinct from the one who goes about her daily life, so the question what for causes a split in Esther's identity. It also leads her to question the existence of God. Katja's experience of grace, by contrast, leads her to a faith in God and is described as follows. Katja and everything, all together, all one. Katja lost in the mass of everything. Katja found and touched by everything. This sense of plenitude and oneness would seem to be the opposite of Esther's alienation and atheism. But the possibility of an underlying relation between the two is hinted at when Katja asks the same question as Esther, though differently inflected. What is it for then, this grace, this goodness? What for? An inner voice urges Katja not to question, but she goes on obsessively interrogating the nature of good and evil, despite all the social pressures on her to stop doing so. At the end of the novel, the modern-day Esther, Katja's mother, speculates, perhaps it would even be possible to return to faith eventually, a new faith that rose out of questions, a possible faith that arose from the possibility of questioning. Katja's response to grace can be interpreted as pointing towards such a possible faith, which we might call a post-secular form of belief. The medieval Esther and Katja therefore come together in the place from which their respective doubt and belief arise, the place of questions. Of Esther's question and an equally heretical possible answer to it, we are told, what for was the inconceivable question. Accident was the inconceivable answer. They did not belong to the times. They were not for now. This implies that Esther is ahead of her times, belonging instead to ours, in which this question and answer are by no means inconceivable. Born a few centuries later, Esther might have been a hero of the Renaissance when it became legitimate to doubt, and her path-breaking meditations can be compared to those of someone who, born at the right time, did become such a hero, René Descartes. Descartes is most famous for his dictum, I think, therefore I am, and in his autobiographical Discourse on the Method of 1647, he explains the origin of this proposition in his attempt, quote, to reject as absolutely false everything as to which I could imagine the least ground of doubt, in order to see if afterwards there remained anything in my belief that was entirely certain. What remains certain in Descartes' belief is, I think, therefore I am, and this leads him to conclude, quote, that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is to think, and that this essential self or soul is entirely distinct from the body, end quote. We can compare this conclusion with the separation of Esther's real self from her bodily self when the question what for occurs to her. However, there is a fundamental difference between Descartes and Esther, for while Descartes' meditation leads him to apprehend an I as active subject, Esther's question comes as though someone else were speaking it. What for, and the further questions which grow like fungal spores have their own existence, independent of Esther. While Descartes rejects every ground of doubt to rest on a bedrock of belief in his own identity as a thinking subject, Esther's self is suspended among a host of doubts. What remains for her is a question, not a dictum. And then again, therefore, a reflection on the relation between doubt and belief goes hand in hand with a critique of the philosophical foundations of the modern or Cartesian from Cartesius, the Latinized form of the name Descartes, individual. This critique is also implicit in the relationship between the modern-day Esther and her medieval namesake, who appears in her dreams. The novel begins in the 14th century, and the transition to the 20th century in the second chapter occurs through the coming to consciousness of the modern-day Esther, who asks, as she wakes, who was Esther? Where did she belong? Which Esther? For an indeterminate period, the world was fluid. Time, geography, identity ran together like pools of colour on damp paper. She was Esther, but that was the only certainty. The finger of identity vacillated over a choice of souls, a multiplicity of Esthers whose when, where, and who differed tantalizingly. Which Esther? This vacillation of identity between multiple Esthers undercuts Descartes' self-certainty, and it is significant that Esther thinks of herself here in the third person, rather than the first, as Esther, rather than I. According to the Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito's reading of the linguist Emile Benveniste, the third person as a grammatical form is entirely different from the first and second persons, in that, falling outside the dialogue between I and you, quote, it is situated precisely at the point of intersection between no one and anyone. Either it is not a person at all, or it is every person. In reality, it is both at the same time, end quote. The third person is therefore a non-person, and as such it offers an alternative to the Cartesian individual, the supposed self-evidence of which is dependent on the first person. I think, therefore I am. As she wakes, Esther, in contrast to Descartes, occupies the space of the third person as she wavers between no one and anyone. The modern-day Esther's vacillating identity is symptomatic of her wider sense of non-belonging, which is both personal and historical. On a personal level, it arises from the fact that she is adopted, which leads her to question who she is. We are told, the questions arose merely because there was an empty space between biology and nurturing, a no man's land where the soil was perfect for those questions to take root. As with the medieval Esther, a sense of disconnection and difference is conducive to the organic growth of questions, the taking root of which contrasts with Esther's own rootlessness, which is further exacerbated by the death of her adoptive parents in a car crash. Furthermore, Esther feels alienated not only from her family, but from the planet itself, in which she sees, quote, a vast, rolling, ever-increasing burden of misery, end quote. This more global alienation can be understood historically as an expression of what Emily Apter has called planetary dysphoria, a profound sense of melancholia and unease in the contemporary world, quote, suffusing every aspect of economic, social, and terrestrial life, end quote. Another important factor in Esther's sense of non-belonging is her Jewishness. Nadia Valman has observed that generations of British Jewish women have returned again and again to the experience of alienation, of living between worlds as a source of critique and creativity. The Jewish writer Diski, then again, is not only exemplary of this return, but also represents it in the modern-day Esther's shuttling between worlds to identify with the medieval Esther as a third person in her search for a better understanding of her own and her daughter's predicaments. In this novel, then, the third person as an alternative, non-personal or depersonalized basis of identity comes into view as a response to multiple dislocations which displace one to the place of questions. The modern-day Esther is an artist, and over the course of the novel she produces a series of plates in which three colours, each representing one of the main characters, are juxtaposed. That this pattern also represents the shape of Diski's novel is made clear when Esther considers naming it Then Again. This title indicates the recurrence of historical trauma in the lives of the contemporary mother and daughter. Again, this speaks to the Jewish experience And Gerd Bayer, our chair, has argued that the novel can be read as reflecting on the repression of traumatic transgenerational memories of the Holocaust. Another trauma that is repeated, particularly in the intersection between the lives of the medieval Esther and Katja, is sexual violence. And it is significant that Diski herself was the victim of the rape, which, in this novel, is experienced by Katja. We learn this from later non-fictional writings of Diski's, in which she describes the event in strikingly similar terms. Diski is then representing her own trauma in the third person. This act of fictionalization is a way of distancing the event, rendering it less painful through its attribution to another. The same could be said of the modern-day Esther's projection of her alienation onto the figure of the medieval Esther. However, in the light of Esposito's theory, we can also interpret these transpositions of the self into the third person otherwise, not as a transferal of trauma to another person, but as its radical depersonalization. Esposito explains that, quote, in addition to escaping a relationship with others, the third person also escapes, to some extent, even a relationship with itself, with its own status as person. Instead, it multiplies itself into such an indefinite number that a sort of general depersonalization results, end quote. This multiplication, which the third person produces, gives us another way of reading the repetition implied in the title, Then Again. Given that the novel is about three characters or three persons, its concluding two paragraphs come as something of a surprise. Try thinking about one person's pain. Try a single agony. Acknowledge it. Add it to the unfinished sum that would in the end, at the end, become a total of what had been understood. Only one individual's total, which was all there could ever be. It was beyond Esther's comprehension how the individual totals might be totaled and what significance such a result would have. Moreover, it was not her business. She had to take what could be taken and to understand what could be understood. It was the least and the most that she could do. She inhaled deeply and with the out-breath let the other Esther go. What remained was her question, and it seemed to Esther as she got up and prepared for the day ahead that what for was as good a question to ask as any she could think of. The one person referred to here is presumably the medieval Esther, whose single agony of dying in flames has just been narrated. And we might infer that focusing on this individual gives the modern-day Esther a way of understanding what she can of suffering without being overwhelmed by the waves of misery sweeping the planet. But the novel has amply demonstrated that one person's pain is never one person's alone. It is shared across individuals and transhistorically. The medieval Esther as a third person with respect to the modern-day Esther and Katja, and in the grammatical sense, embodies a pain which is, as Esposito says of the third person, constitutively impersonal. It is both singular and plural. Hence the paradoxical mathematics of one individual's total pain, which was all there could ever be. Thinking about one third person's pain is therefore not turning a blind eye to everyone else's, but thinking pain in a way which moves beyond the boundaries of the Cartesian individual. This way of thinking is prompted by today's planetary dysphoria, and at the same time it holds out the possibility of living with that condition. Diski's Then Again teaches us that such a mode of thinking in the third person arises in the place of questions, where doubt and belief, the medieval Esther's apprehension of the non-existence of God and Katja's of the plenitude of his divine grace, come together precisely where Esposito says the third person occurs, at the point of intersection between no one and anyone. Either it is not a person at all, or it is every person. In reality, it is both at the same time. Thank you.